Hi, and welcome back. Today we are going to cover pre-Columbian societies. The name pre-Columbian refers to the time period before the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. In this sense, Columbus is a historical time marker. There is the world before and after Columbus. As noted in our last lecture, there were many native people who built cities for thousands of years before the arrival of Columbus. So most of history in the Americas is pre-Columbian. Today, I want to continue the overview of cultures that we started in the last lecture. In this lecture, we will cover three main topics: human migration over the ages, environment and social structure, and agriculture and social structure. Okay, let's get started. I want to start with these images that we saw in the last lecture. As you recall, this artwork comes from a culture known as the Olmec. The reason we brought up the Olmec previously was to get a sense of one of the many complex pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas. I also noted that many people say that the artwork looks Asian or African. In fact, we could rightly say that the Olmec have both African and Asian ancestry. The bigger issue is how far back contact occurred between the Americas, Asia, and Africa. This opens the door to our first topic, so let's go there now. This map provides a general picture of patterns of human migration over time. The patterns shown here follow the out of Africa theory. This says that archaic Homo sapiens, humanoids that are anatomically like modern people, appeared in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. It also says that over time, many waves of migration emanated outward from Africa. The causes for migration are likely many: following game animal, overpopulation, community conflict, and drought are possible reasons. Dispersion of populations occurred many times over a long period, and not necessarily in a single direction. Instead, it was likely a back and forth process. For the purposes of our class, we will see populations of Asia spreading from India, China, Australia, and Mongolia. It is believed that Asian populations likely traveled north and east to Siberia and across the Bering Strait, ultimately ending up in the North American continent. This is one reason that the artwork of the Olmec appears Asian. The theory that explains this migration is called the Bering Strait theory. Let's turn to it now. In the map on the right, Asia is shown at the top. It depicts migration from what is today Siberia to Alaska, down through Canada, the US, and ultimately South America. This theory says that during the last ice age, Asia and North America were connected. People followed game animal from Asia using ice age land corridors. There is no consensus on the dates for this, but it is generally believed that the migrations occurred between 50,000 BCE to about 15,000 BCE. 15,000 BCE is particularly important because it marks the end of the most recent ice age. From about 15,000 to about 12,000 BCE, the Earth warmed to temperatures and patterns that we have today. Global warming caused glaciers to melt and ocean levels to rise. As a result, the corridors that connected the continents were submerged, thus cutting off further land migration. Even though the theory is generally accepted, there is relatively little physical evidence of artifacts such as settlements and hunting tools. Nevertheless, there is important biological evidence. One is a similarity in dental patterns between Asian and Native American groups. Another is similar blood type and similar physical appearance. And recently, DNA samples show a close connection between Asia and the Americas. The earliest human remains are dated between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE. Interestingly, the oldest remains, dated about 12,000 BCE, were found at the tip of South America. Even though not as old, Many more human remains, dated about 8,000 BCE, have been found in North America. The red line in the map depicts the migration patterns that people followed. But notice there are blue lines that follow the coastline. They show a different form of migration. The theory that explains this migration is called the Pacific Rim theory. The Pacific Rim theory does not dispute the Bering Strait theory. Instead, it adds complexity. It agrees with the general timeline of the Bering Strait theory and the importance of the last ice age, but it contends that in addition to opening up land bridges between continents, the last ice age also exposed an ice shelf along the Aleutian Islands. These volcanic islands were more fully exposed, which provided easy stopping points for fishing communities. In addition, the region is extremely rich in fishing resources. Beyond that, the sea provides much faster transportation than land travel. People could travel farther and in larger groups. Over time, populations were pulled further out, thus populating Pacific Islands and also crossing to North America. So far, we have been discussing the movement of populations from Asia to the Americas. Let's now move across North America to the Atlantic coast. Keeping in mind what was just said about the Pacific Rim theory, let's apply some of those concepts to population movements between North America and far northern Europe. This region is referred to as the North Atlantic Crescent. This is an ice shelf that was exposed during the last ice age. And as with the Pacific Rim, maritime populations followed sea life and established communities in coastal locations. Migration of people over time in the Atlantic and Pacific likely had many similarities. But there are also important differences. It appears that activity along the North Atlantic Crescent were much later than in the Pacific Rim. Much of the activity appears to have occurred after the last ice age. In addition, there is evidence of a group of people known as the Red Paint people migrating from North America to Northern Europe. The Red Paint people flourished between 3000 and 1000 BCE. The name comes from use of large quantities of red ochre to cover the bodies of their dead, as well as goods left in the graves. There is a lot of evidence of these people throughout New England and eastern Canadian regions. More recently, evidence has been uncovered in Iceland and Scandinavia, indicating population movements between the Americas and Northern Europe. So did the Red Paint people come from Europe or the Americas? Most evidence points to a North American origin, but it is not conclusive. Reviewing human migration, we see that the Americas were populated after other areas of the globe. But migration is not a one-time occurrence. It likely occurred many times, in many different ways, and did not follow in a singular direction. It is important to recognize that Columbus's journey to the Americas is relatively recent. Migration to the America goes back tens of thousands of years. Up to this point, we have been discussing the movement of populations. Now let's take a look at the types of communities that developed in the Americas. What I would like to discuss here is how environment affects social structures. We have seen this map before. It breaks North America into environmental regions and the related methods of subsistence or economic activities. In an earlier lecture, we discussed Mesoamerica and the southeast of what will become the United States. Let's take a look at a few other areas. In the yellow were regions where hunting was the main activity. In the orange were areas that had hunting and gathering. And in the turquoise were areas dominated by fishing societies. I want to review some of these areas to demonstrate how the environment affected social structure. It is important to know that the people we call Native Americans, or Indians, represented many different cultures with differing social and political practices. It is helpful to think of them as separate nations. To understand the wide range of Indian nations, the key thing to keep in mind is the interaction of social structure with resources available in the environment. This means that the environment has an influence on how the people organize their lives. In many ways, this is a very straightforward idea. Think about building a city in the desert. The environment has limited water, so people would likely not have extensive lawns that soak up large volumes of water. There might be laws or simple social pressure telling people to limit their water use. The key thing to keep in mind is that social practice follows what is available in the environment. Keeping this in mind, let's take a look at how ancient societies were affected by the environment. We will start with the Great Plains region. In this area, pre-Columbian cultures were dominated by hunting. In these communities, social and political structures were based on the realities of hunting activities. First, it is believed that these communities were matrilineal. This means that people followed their bloodlines through women. The reason for this is that women were the most stable members of the community. Men, who were the prime hunters, were exposed to dangers of the hunt. They were often killed or injured and did not return to the community. Conversely, women, as the bearers and prime caregivers of children, were always present in the community. So we have societies where women stayed close to home, they captured small animals, and gathered edible herbs and plants. It makes sense that the social structure would organize themselves around women. The political structure of these communities also gave women a significant voice. Again, because they spent most of their time close to home and men often were not present, decision-making included women's voices. Women did not have an exclusive voice. They likely shared decision-making. This form of social and political structure is referred to as egalitarian. It is probably a mistake to think of these societies focusing on equality in the modern sense. It is more likely that men and women had different areas of authority. Family and community size in these communities were small. The reason is they needed to be mobile in order to follow migrating herds. In addition to small populations, these communities limited their material belongings. Fewer belongings meant that it was easier to pack and follow the game animals. But small family size and limited material goods don't just come by accident. Society created rules and pressures to impose practices that promoted success in their environment. Regarding material property, it was logical for societies to promote communal ownership. Why have more than one of something if it could be shared effectively? Regarding family size, society limited the number of children any woman might have. Since women carried the responsibility of childbirth, they also had social authority related to sex. Sex was controlled by women. In the case of an unwanted pregnancy, women ate certain plants that had a tendency of causing a spontaneous abortion. If that did not work, then infanticide may have been practiced, meaning the women were responsible for killing the child or leaving it for the animals. Fishing societies share some of the same traits with hunting societies, especially related to matrilineal bloodlines, but they differ in others, especially in relation to family size. In fishing communities, men would either go out to sea or along the coastline in search for food. Fishing, like hunting, was dangerous. Because of this, men often did not return, so society tended to follow heritage through women. They were matrilineal. But unlike hunting societies, communities did not need to pack their belongings to follow fish. In turn, permanent settlements were used. As a result, there was not the same pressure to limit material goods or maintain extremely small communities. So we find little evidence of abortion or infanticide. Hunting and fishing societies were very different than those that practiced intense agriculture. All the communities that we reviewed in our last lecture were agricultural societies. The most notable feature is that agricultural societies have much bigger populations that build large cities. But there are other differences as well. Let's now turn to these groups. Let's begin by looking at this image. What we have here are the three sisters. They are corn, beans, and squash. These plants are key to North American agricultural societies. Farming societies discovered that each of these plants were more productive when grown together. The reason for this is that each one provides something the other needs. corn provide bean vines a stalk to climb and expose themselves to the sun. Squash that grows across the ground provides nutrients that both beans and corn need. The key to agricultural societies is that they focus on increasing productivity of plant products. This interest had many economic, political, and social consequences. People in most cultures throughout history practice some form of agriculture, but intense agriculture refers to economies that are reliant on highly productive farm goods. Intense agricultural societies appeared about 5000 BCE in ancient China and Mesopotamia. By the way, the modern nations of Iran, Iraq, and Syria are in what was Mesopotamia. Intense farming appeared about 1500 years later in Mesoamerica. Appearance of intense agriculture is related to limited availability of game animal, but also to regions that have arable land, land that is relatively rich in nutrients, water, as well as having relatively temperate weather. All of these factors were present in Mesoamerica and what would become the southeast of the U.S. The importance of intense agriculture is that it provides a surplus that allows society to expand and elaborate its economic and political structure. We could also reverse the logic. In order for a society to farm successfully, it needs to develop a more elaborate economic and political structure. Let's examine this a little further. Farming communities tend to be patrilineal and patriarchal. This is almost the exact opposite of hunting societies. Hunting communities tend to follow women's bloodlines. They are matrilineal. They also tended to have egalitarian political structures, where everybody's voice was included. Patrilineal communities follow the male bloodline, while patriarchy means that the political system is based on the voice of men. To understand why there was such a difference, we need to address the requirements of agriculture. A large labor force is required in order to farm successfully. Conversely, if a society is good at farming, they can sustain a large labor pool. This is called a mutually supporting cycle. The big thing to keep in mind is that there is social pressure to expand the total number of people in the community. To expand the community, pressure is placed on women to have more children, which means that women go through the dangers of childbearing more often. Each time a woman has a child, she risks her life, with an overall effect of increasing women's mortality rate in the community. So, where hunting societies expose men to more physical dangers than women, farming societies expose women to more dangers. The result pushes communities towards the bloodlines of men, patrilineal heritage. Economically, intense farming allows communities to provide bigger and more stable food supplies. They tend to produce a surplus food supply, which then allows them to develop more complex economic, social, and political systems. Thinking back to the artwork of the Olmec and the pyramid structures built by many pre-Columbian societies, it was a surplus food that allowed those cities to develop. With this in mind, let's turn to the concept of hierarchy, a system of organization where one group of people is ranked above the other according to status and authority. Societies that practice intense farming tend to develop social and political hierarchies. This mural that comes from a Mayan burial tomb is a great reflection of these ideas. At the top, we see a single ruler. As we move down, each level has more people. The mural illustrates social roles. The ruler at the top has very elegant clothing. As we move down, the clothing becomes less elegant. Also, each level depicts social roles. At the top, we have the ruler. The second level has administrator priests. The third level has warriors, and an additional level of priests. The fourth has artisans. These are skilled craftspeople that produce goods such as pottery, tools, and artwork. And at the bottom, we have the farmers. It is interesting to consider that pyramids can serve as a metaphor for hierarchical, social, and political systems of the communities that built them. There's a sharp contrast between hunting societies and those that practice intense farming. Nevertheless, it is important to know that they represent ends of the economic, political, and social scale. As noted earlier in the lecture, social structures are different depending on the opportunities that the environment offers. Native American nations had a wide range of practices. I want to close today's lecture with a few other images of Indian nations that represent a mix of the practices we discussed. The images here come from an artist named John White. They are from the Virginia colony around 1590 ACE. In them, we get a good sense of body decorations and clothing. These villages normally had a few hundred people. We also see they practiced farming as well as hunting. Written documents from the English settlers indicate that they were matrilineal, and if not egalitarian, they were also not strictly patriarchal. The images we see here come from the northwest of what today is the US and Canada. These are good examples of maritime cultures. These are fishing societies, and like those of Virginia, were matrilineal and had a mix of political participation. They were not patriarchal. In these images, we also see totem poles. The word totem refers to an object or an animal that has spiritual meaning to a community. These totem poles depict animals that exerted spiritual force in the community. If we look at this village, we see that each house has a different totem pole. Each pole serves as a family crest, telling the heritage of the clan. The word clan refers to a group of close-knit and interrelated families. Totemic images are closely related to appropriation. As discussed in our previous lecture, appropriation refers to taking the power of something and giving it to yourself. So in addition to showing family lineage, the totemic images are claims of power gained from their animal ancestors. For now, we're going to close the lecture. Okay, we'll see you in class.